Now, U.S. President Donald Trump is facing a midnight deadline to secure congressional authorization for the war against Iran.
Well, the 60-day clock that triggered when Trump notified Congress of strikes in early March, it required the administration to begin winding down hostilities unless lawmakers authorize the use of force. With no such approval in place, the deadline sets up direct constitutional clash between the White House and Congress.
Now, Democrats say the president is already on shaky legal ground and will be in clear violation once the threshold passes. The administration disputes that interpretation, arguing that the clock was effectively paused by a ceasefire announced last month.
On Iran, ultimately, I would defer to the White House and White House counsel on that. However, we are in a ceasefire right now, which our understanding means the 60-day clock pauses or stops in a ceasefire. You're not in. Yeah. It's our understanding, just so you know.
Okay, well, I do not believe the statute would support that. I think the 60 days runs maybe tomorrow, and it's going to pose a really important legal question for the administration. We have serious constitutional concerns, and we don't want to layer those with additional statutory concerns. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Now, with tens of thousands of U.S. troops deployed in West Asia and mounting economic and political costs at home, the dispute presents a high-stakes test for Congress's authority over war powers. More than 50 years after the law was passed in the wake of the Vietnam War. With the Trump administration appearing to bypass the requirement, it is uncertain whether the U.S. president will seek authorization. Trump on Wednesday said that the U.S. is doing really well in what he described as military operations and not war.
The country's doing really well, and that's despite a military operation. I don't call it a war, because we'd rather have a military operation. Where really, Iran is dying to make a deal. I can only tell you that. I don't want to get into it, but they cannot be nuclear. Other than that.
And well, to discuss more on this, we're now being joined by John Ehret live from Washington, D.C. He's a senior policy director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast, Mr. Ehret. And I, of course, like to begin with this deadline, which is going to end in a few hours from now. Do you think Trump will be able to get congressional authorization?
I think that the White House is not going to seek congressional authorization. They have chosen to define what is going on in Iran right now as not being a war. And so, according to their own logic, they do not need war authorization from Congress. Unfortunately, Congress is going to let this go because if the Republican Party holds a majority in both houses, and there have been repeated efforts to pass some sort of war powers resolution, and that has failed.
Right, but having said that, the administration argues that the ceasefire effectively pauses the clock. But is there any legal basis to determine that, or is this just a creative interpretation that we're seeing by the Trump administration? Because if a ceasefire can pause a deadline, doesn't that open the door for the administration to stretch any military, confrontation indefinitely?
It would seem to. I'm not a legal scholar, so I cannot debate the legal points of this ceasefire or not ceasefire as it may be. But what I look at is the history. In 2011, there was NATO action against Libya. It lasted more than 60 days. And at that time, there was a Democratic president and a Democratic majority in Congress. And at that time, the Congress also did not authorize chose not to debate the authorization of the War Powers Act at that time. So the history is on the side of giving the administration a pass.
And that being said, what does this mean for Americans? Because we just did say that the gas prices have gone up. How are the Americans looking at this decision, if at all this gets authorized by the Congress?
I think most Americans are looking at it as politics. The Republicans are supporting their president. Democrats are opposing the president. I don't think most analysis is much more than that. Certainly, most Americans are tired of paying higher prices for gas and for everything else, and would like to see this war concluded as soon as possible. The Trump administration claims it has a way to do this through negotiation, but we have not seen any progress.
Right. Do you think that the United States is deliberately creating this gray zone and, this ambiguity to where we are at not quite war, but also not quite at peace here, to maintain pressure without triggering legal or political consequences, according to you, Mr. Ayers?
It certainly is possible. If the Trump administration believes that some sort of peace agreement is near, they don't want to undermine it by having their war powers taken away. The threat of violent action produces coercion, and they don't want to have that tool taken away from them. So it could be that, or it could be just that they don't have an idea and they're trying to figure out what is a better plan.
And taking that point forward, Trump has said that Iran is dying to negotiate a deal. But recently, Iran's Supreme Leader, Moshtaba Khamenei, he's declared that, and this is via a statement on television, that Iran is now in the driver's seat in the crisis. Of course, these are conflicting statements coming in from both sides, not just from now, but of course from some time now. How do you assess, are we any closer to a deal?
I would assess this as standard negotiating tactics on both sides. Both sides are trying to make their position seem as strong as possible to extract the greatest possible concessions from the other. So it is certainly in Iran's interest now that they seem to be in as strong a position as they can be, and that they have all the leverage through the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. It's in the U.S. interest to pretend that Iran is close to economic collapse. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
Right, and while that seems to be the case, and talking about this economic nuclear weapon that Marco Rubio described, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and we understand that this is a leverage that Iran did not have before the US and Israel decided to bomb Iran on the 28th of Feb. But now that it does, and all of us have seen how consequential it has proven to be, do you think Iran would be willing to, let go of it, and at what cost?
Iran has certainly suffered due to the war, both from the attacks and from damage to its economy. It is certainly in Iran's interest to reopen trade and reopen the sale of oil to its customers around the world. So the incentive is there for Iran to make peace, to make some kind of deal, but they want to get as good a deal as possible. The reason I see for hope right now is that the Trump administration is finally defining a concrete aim for the conflict. That is, that Iran not have a nuclear weapon. That's actually good. We know what that looks like. There was an agreement in 2015. It wasn't perfect. It had some flaws, but it can be tweaked, and that can be a basis for a very lasting peace agreement.
No, that's a very good point you put there, because of something that has been a point of contention is not just Strait of Hormuz, but also the nuclear deal. And Iran has time and again said that they have not been enriching uranium for weapons. It's just for civilian use. That's setting apart. There's another issue I'd like you to speak upon. Now, you have been a former member of the U.S. delegation to NATO, and very recently we've seen Donald Trump comment on Italy and Spain, saying that they will pull out U.S. troops from Italy and Spain due to their opposition to the Iran war. This is, of course, after proposing a similar reduction in Germany. How do you assess this move from U.S.?
This is not recent. The threats against Germany pulling out U.S. troops go back to the first Trump administration in 2019, 2020. This is standard leverage that President Trump tries to exert on NATO allies, because the U.S. bases are large and contribute quite significantly to the local economies. So he thinks he has leverage by threatening to withdraw U.S. troops. In reality, though, the basing arrangements are very complex and very costly, and they have been there a long time, and so it's not as easy as simply taking troops out.
Right. Well, of course, we'll be looking forward to both the issues going forward. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ayers, and giving your perspective on those very important issues. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.